Welcome back to the 6Ps podcast. It's been a minute, but we're back, and today's podcast, we're looking at our comparative texts of the Crucible and the Dressmaker, and we're going to be focusing on the key theme of power. As always, when we look at a key theme, it's really important to look at vocabulary and looking at ways that we can explore these themes in different ways to improve our expression and fluency. Power, meaning the possession of control, authority, or influence over others. And some keywords that I'd be looking to embed into my writing would be phrases like authority, control, and leadership, particularly when we're talking about having power over the communities. In a different sense, I've also used the terms strength, force, and weight for a few reasons. One of those is to look at how to overcome power and the strength that's needed to do that, particularly by our protagonists, but also thinking about the power dynamics in some of the relationships as well, and considering who holds the strength in those. A really broad question to look at to begin with and to ask yourself is, in Dungatar and Salem, who holds the power? I've looked at the Crucible, and the characters that immediately sprung to mind were Reverend Parris, who, as his name suggests, is the Reverend and the religious leader of Salem. And by extension, given this is a theocratic society, he's also holds the legal power as well. We've got Thomas Putnam, who is powerful in this community because he is a wealthy landowner. And we've got Deputy Governor Judge Danforth, who comes into the play in Act 3, and he also holds legal authority over the witch trials and over the town of Salem. The last one I've mentioned, and you'll notice there's a question mark at the end, is Abigail and the girls, because of course they don't hold any power to begin with. And we know that based on the very, very first page of the texts, where it talks about the fact that, like the rest of Salem, he, being Parris, never conceived that the children were anything but thankful for being permitted to walk straight, eyes slightly lowered, arms at the sides, and mouths shut until bidden to speak. Hopefully you've memorised that quote by now. But that's a really important quotation to showcase and highlight or emphasise the importance of their rise to power later in the text, particularly in Act 3. When it comes to the Dressmaker and Dungatar, the first person I thought of was Evan Pettyman. He is the Shire councillor, and he's also, as we'll note later on in this text, quite powerful in his relationship as well in a physical sense. He abuses his wife, and to an extent as well, the other women in the community. Mr. Almanac too holds power. He is the chemist, and there isn't a doctor within 30 miles. So he's really important for the health of the community. And so too, like Evan Pettyman, he's abusive in his relationship with his wife, Irma. Now, Sergeant Farrett is, of course, the policeman, so he does hold power to an extent, but he is not as imposing with that power as other characters, or as perhaps the previous sergeant was. He's quite lax in his duty. He doesn't mind the fact that the pub stays open after 6 o'clock, for example. And the last one is the Beaumonts, who hold the social power within the town. And Elsbeth in particular is an important character to look at there. And we might discuss briefly later on whether this is actually power or whether it's merely a facade for others. So looking at evidence in terms of who holds the power, and we'll begin with the Crucible and Reverend Parris, who states in Act 1, there is either obedience or the church will burn like hell is burning. A nice simile there. But he demands obedience from his parishioners. It's also stated in Act 1 that he felt insulted if someone rose to shut the door without first asking for permission. But he holds a fear that his enemies and factions within the community will remove him from his powerful position. Thomas Putnam regarded himself as the intellectual superior and in fact owned a lot of land, hence he was powerful in the village. However, this was not enough for him to get his candidate over the line to become Reverend. Instead, Paris won that, and consequentially, there is animosity between the pair. Judge Danforth in his stage directions is described as holding an exact loyalty to his position and his cause. And he maintains that throughout Act 4, refusing to postpone the hangings. In fact, he says he'll hang 10,000 before he postpones. Slightly different tack is Abigail and the girls, who are initially described as having little to no power at all, not even allowed to talk, and by Act 3, Danforth states the entire contention of the state is that the voice of heaven speaks through the children. They hold all the power in the court. Looking at the dressmaker, Evan Pettyman holds his power because of his position as Shire President and the fact that he is Marigold's husband. Her name is ironic, Marigold, because Evan married gold, he married money, and that's how he attains his power and wealth. Mr. Almanac tended the townsfolk with the contents of his refrigerator, and only Mr. Almanac knew what you needed and why. This is where he holds all the power from a medicinal perspective. In fact, there was no doctor within 30 miles. He, in fact, punishes villagers by poisoning their poultices and antidotes, for example, such as Faith O'Brien. Sergeant Farrett does hold power. He is the local policeman, but he was immediately posted to Dungatar because he tried to design new police uniforms. But the locals are pleased with him because he is quite lax in the way that he dishes out the law. Elspeth Beaumont had heirs. She was a farmer's daughter who married a well-to-do grazier's son, and she holds the social power within Dungatar. These characters hold social and legal power in their communities, and they enjoy their lofty positions, and generally they target those who don't. Yet these aren't the only types of power that we see in the text. So how do characters gain, maintain and build power? We'll start with the Crucible and Abigail Williams, who in the initial stage directions is described as having an endless capacity for dissembling. Yet by Act 2 it's described that where she walks the crowd will part like the Sea of Israel, comparing her to Moses in the Old Testament. She's able to gain power based on the fear that permeates the Salem community through the witch trials, and she's also able to gain power by using information provided to her by the other villagers against others. She also sparks fear within the other girls, and as a result, they obey everything that she asks of them. Thomas Putnam gains and maintains power essentially by gaining more and more land. In fact, it's suggested that this man is killing his neighbours for their land, and he's responsible for George Jacob's death because he's the only one who could potentially afford it if he died. In The Dressmaker, Evan Pettyman maintains his power because of those rigid social norms. The men and women were polite and cordial to him, as is quoted early on in the text, and because of that, no one dares speak out against him. Gertrude is very interesting. She, like Abigail initially, doesn't really hold much power in the town. William Beaumont, in fact, ignores her in the opening parts of the text, and she's described as being large and sensible and quite industrious, which Sergeant Farrett sort of comments on the fact that it's quite progressive, but ultimately not worthwhile in Dungatar at the time. Yet, on her wedding day, she's described as being curvy and succulent. She gains power firstly through Tilly's fashion and the way that Tilly dresses her, but also through her sexually assertive nature. This is how she wins over William Beaumont. For Tilly, it is also through fashion. She provides dresses for the town and transforms the town, in fact. Yet this is only externally and not internally because they are the same people inside. And Teddy comments that they've grown airs. They referring to the townspeople. They think they're classy and you're not doing them any good. Speaking of Tilly, I think it's really important to compare the protagonists and look at the strength that they show in this text. And interestingly enough, both John Proctor and Tilly are guilt-ridden at the start. John Proctor because he's committed adultery against his wife, and he's quoted in his authorial commentary as being a sinner against his own vision of decent conduct. Compare that to Tilly's guilt, which she describes metaphorically as being like a black thing, a weight that makes itself invisible, then creeps back when I feel safest. It is the town that makes her feel guilty. In terms of both characters, they are victims of their circumstances. John Proctor because of the religious values and beliefs of the town, but also the fear and the corrupt leadership in Salem. Tilly Sue is a victim of the conservative values. Obviously, she is an outcast because she's an illegitimate child, but also because of the hypocritical nature of authority and the fear the town holds towards her. Their endings are slightly different though. For John Proctor, he finds strength at the end through his wife and Rebecca Nurse and their fate. He rips up the warrant, but also his apology and his confession, and in doing so, he defies authority. As a result, he maintains his reputation, or as Elizabeth describes it, as his goodness, and he finds the strength to stand up for his reputation. It's a little bit different in The Dressmaker, where vengeance reigns. Tilly says that pain will no longer be our curse, it will be our revenge and our reason. And this is the grief she feels after Teddy and Molly's death, and she blames the townspeople for this, and she seeks vengeance. And in the end, it's stated that everything was black and smoking when she sets fire to the town and punishes them all, including Sergeant Farrett, whose clothes she burns. An interesting thing to note, given that they did form a close relationship, but one that suggests he too is guilty for what happened to her. So, what else could you consider from both these texts when it comes to the theme of power? I would definitely consider the gender dynamics in both the play and the novel, and look at female empowerment and agency within these patriarchal societies. How do Abigail and the girls gain and maintain power? In the same sense, consider Tilly, Gertrude, even Marigold, and look at the way they are initially powerless, but ultimately gain some sort of power, not just within the town, but also within their relationships. Consider the notion of intergenerational power, power passed on from one generation to the next. Consider the Pettymans. Look at the way that Evan and Stuart both treat Tilly. It is very, very similar. To the same extent, consider Evan's treatment of his wife Marigold. The Putnams are an interesting case to look at as well, because we know that Thomas Putnam used his daughter to cry out on George Jacobs, and how this is used in order to build further power within Salem. Think about the language. The graphic imagery is clear for everyone to see in terms of the way that Miss Dim and Stuart treat Tilly and abuse Tilly physically and verbally. You could also look at the scene where Tilly's name is scratched out at the ball, but also look at Evan Pettyman and Mr. Almanac and the way they treat their wives and other members of the community. You could also look at repetition, particularly in the Crucible. Judge Danforth states that there will be no postponement, and he continually repeats that in order to maintain his power and authority over the witch trials. You could also look at the stage directions and the authorial intrusions to show how characters' reputations are built. Think about symbols. In the Crucible, paper and books are the sign of authority. We only need to look at Reverend Hale and his introduction. Also look at the way that John Proctor tears up the confession at the end of the text. In fact, he also tears up the warrant for his wife's arrest. So here we see John Proctor twice defying authority and the strength it takes to do that. In The Dressmaker, I think fashion is really important to look at. Fashion is not only used to showcase an individual's power, but also to gain power over others. And look at the way that Gertrude uses fashion in order to be sexually assertive towards William, and not only gain his attention, but his hand in marriage. So let's consider some key ideas revolving around power and authority in the texts. Here are some example ideas that you might want to write on. Both texts explore hypocritical and abusive leaders who suppress and torment outcasts. So here we can use the theme of outcasts to explore power. Both texts portray rigid social structures and questions their legitimacy. Both texts examine the corrupt nature of authority and the double standards within the communities. Both texts explore the contrasting power dynamics within relationships. This is something we didn't look at in this video, but something you could, if you wanted to, explore in more depth and detail, and look at the relationships within the text and how they find strength and who holds the power in those. Predominantly, you'll find it will be the men. Both texts suggest that strength is required in overcoming adversity. Here we're particularly looking at our protagonists, aren't we, in Tilly and John Proctor. And the last one, both texts depict individuals, particularly women, elevating their social status and attaining power. And if you explore this in a bit of depth, you'll find that when they elevate their social status and gain some sort of power, it often doesn't last for long. Look at Gertrude as an example here, how she gains power but ultimately loses it. She goes mad and she's yelled at by Elspeth as being a stupid grocer's girl. In the Crucible, Abigail does hold power for some period of time, but ultimately flees. And in the epilogue, it's suggested that she became a prostitute. Let's look at some sample topics now based on the theme of power. Those in power will stop at nothing to maintain it. Compare how this idea is demonstrated in the Crucible and the Dressmaker, and we'll look at a couple of sample paragraphs later on based on this theme. In what ways does the Crucible and the Dressmaker examine the consequences of corruption and hypocrisy? This is a double ID essay question, so we're looking at corruption and hypocrisy, and think about the ways they work together. They're all liars, sinners and hypocrites. To the European world, the whole province was a barbaric frontier inhabited by a sect of fanatics. To what extent do the individuals in both texts enable those in power to abuse their authority? I really like this because it's looking not just at leaders or authority figures in the text, but also the citizens in each town and how they enable the authority figures to abuse that. And the last one, how do both texts explore the lack of power provided to women in the respective communities? Gender is obviously the theme here, and you would connect that to the idea of power. When it comes to paragraph writing, of course, we know that we need to look at both texts equally. I definitely encourage you to include both similarities and differences within your paragraphs. So let's have a look at this sample paragraph. It's that sort of mid to high range, and it's based on that first essay topic on maintaining power. Ham and Miller bemoan self-centered desires of individuals who stop at nothing for personal gain through love. In the Crucible, Abigail's endless capacity for dissembling exacerbates her unsavoury character, whereby her rise to power in pursuit for John Proctor to look up at her window is frowned upon by Miller's commentary. Therein, the 17-year-old's animalistic references to the sweating stallion contradicts the Puritan values of Salem, and thus Miller insinuates that love should not sway an individual away from societal codes of conduct. Furthermore, it is the Crucible's finale that serves as Abigail's ironic punishment, despite her best attempts to portray herself as a proper girl that wants the sweet love of Jesus. Miller's criticism is exacerbated as her whore's vengeance sees Abigail transcend into a prostitute in Boston. It is through this development arc that Miller presages those who selfishly pursue love by any means do not deserve access to their desires. Similarly, the Dressmaker explores monetary desires through love and, like Miller, laments such individuals through denying their power. Worth less than perceived, Elspeth Beaumont's imperious attitude that did not agree with Dungatar, despite her backdrop as a farmer's daughter, allows Ham to exaggerate the impurities of society's everyday flaws like hypocrisy. Hence, the Dressmaker extols this notion and refutes such individuals from their egotistical perceptions of themselves, following their attainment of power through wealthy loved ones. Herein, Elsbeth's dead fox fur beckons to the finale of the text, where Ham enforces that her basest beliefs are to equate the death of her moth-eaten clothing, thus suggesting that despite her rise to monetary high points, this attribute alone is not enough to maintain her position in society. Although both Miller and Ham exhibit similar arcs that these individuals explore, Ham is able to use this irony to ground such characters before their self-esteem overwhelms their personality, whereas Miller's interpretation punishes those who are ambitious with their love. Ultimately, it is the denial of an individual from attaining extraordinary levels of self-gain through love where Ham and Miller converge to suggest that power maintenance is not possible, no matter how hard it is grasped upon. Let's look at a second paragraph. Moreover, those in power serve short-lived positions of authority within both texts, as their investment in their personal desires proves to deter their desire for control. Reverend Paris exhibits as such, devoting anything possible to attain his ministry, such as investing into Abigail despite possessing no interest in children. Though unethical and against charitable values of religious societies, Paris defends his niece in court to maintain his power that was finally attained and threatened to be overthrown. Miller's stage directions and intrusions depicting a man quaking in fear and in a sweat, foreshadowing a disruption in the maintenance to his authority. It is made clear that Abigail robs Paris towards the finale, with the power-hungry individual voted from office despite all attempts to preserve his term. It is through these passages where Miller condemns the attempts made by individuals to pursue their personal upkeeping of their desires and suggests that people should stay faithful regardless of circumstances. Furthermore, Ham equates such underlying messages through her lustful and unsavoury leader in Evan Pettyman, a man who touched women and continues to showcase his intrinsic self-desire for sexual deviance throughout the Dressmaker. However, Pettyman's reaction to Tilly's arrival in Dungatar, where he spilled his coffee and swore, presages a disruption to the councillor's leadership, one that permitted Evan to position individuals as he wanted. Ham's lack of graphic detail in Pettyman's interaction with Marigold illustrates a simultaneous sense of passivity from Marigold, but also Pettyman's stagnant approach to his power. This attitude renders Pettyman useless towards the finale, as his inability to remain proactive allows Tinny Dunnage to cure Marigold, alleviating the sexual dominance that Pettyman abuses. Herein, Ham criticises the lack of proactiveness that individuals possess following their rise to the top, and punishes Pettyman for such inaction. While Miller attests that individuals should remain truthful and honest to maintain their authority within insular communities, Ham suggests that inaction stagnates avenues to success and laments those who remain complacent during their leadership. Now it's over to you. Have a go at researching power and look at some of those characters who have power, who have no power, who gain power, who maintain power, and who lose power. Think about writing paragraphs on some of those ideas outlined, or even write a practice essay on some of the topics mentioned before as well. Good luck.